In 1960, it was a difficult transition time in Columbia.
And if I wanted to get an ice cream cone and I'd walk in the front door, I'd stand right there at the front of the counter. I couldn't sit down. Now, Stu would be sitting there, but I couldn't sit down. And she'd tell me, we'd play this little game. She'd come and tell me, I can't serve you up there. And I'd have to walk down to the end of the counter on the other end, and she'd bring me an ice cream cone then. But she wouldn't serve me up front. Now, that's crazy.
It wasn't until probably 5 or 6 years, maybe 8 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, that Columbia schools were actually integrated.
It was a struggle for everyone. Remember, we were pretty much of a segregated community. People felt like a segregated community, and they didn't quite know how to accept each other. Either way, blacks or whites.
For almost 90 years following the Civil War, America was dominated by racial segregation, with separate schools, facilities, and even separate communities for Black Americans. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus the Board of Education of the city of Topeka, Kansas, brought the legal end of school segregation, but changing the law did not immediately change our schools or our communities. Desegregation caused much turbulence across America, with riots, protests, and Klan violence. Yet Columbia, Missouri made a quieter transition. When asked why, many community leaders point to the efforts of a high school counselor and his family. That counselor was Elliott Battle.
I received an offer for a job as a principal of the Dalton High School in Dalton, Missouri, in Sheridan County, and I went there and worked for a few years. And Dr. Aslin, who was the superintendent of schools here at Columbia, had learned about what we were doing in Dalton, and he called and asked me if I had interest in coming to Columbia. This was 1956, to work at the Douglas Segregated School. I made the trip over to Columbia, and I went down Providence Road where Douglas School was located. And I saw the housing situation here, and I saw the lifestyle of African Americans here, and I thanked Dr. Aslin, but I told him I thought that we were going to be moving to the state of California. He called a second time, and he says, would you consider coming and just meeting with the board and talking about the position? And I came in and met the board, but I told them that Muriel and I both had to be employed, and since they didn't employ both husband and wife, that we were going to have to turn the position down. Well, a couple of weeks later, I got a call from him saying that the board had met and they changed the policy. We both then went ahead and took the job, but I told Dr. Aslin we were taking it for 1 year. I wasn't going to stay in Columbia. And that stretched out to my entire professional life.
The Columbia, Missouri Elliott moved into wasn't without its successes and problems. Blacks had to endure separate schools, unjust treatment, and unequal services. Before the start of the first school year, after the Supreme Court's Brown versus the Board of Education ruling, the Columbia School Board formally ended segregation on the recommendation of Superintendent Aslin.
All over the country, integration brought all sorts of confusion and anxiety to everyone involved, black and white. You can remember the pictures in Little Rock when the National Guard had to come and quell the violence when those schools were integrated. So there was a great deal of consternation on both sides. Elliott and Muriel were in the thick of that, and they performed in such an admirable way. They pushed through that anxiety. They gave comfort to folks on both sides of the issue. And I think in their quiet way, they carried Columbia through that tumultuous time in a way that allowed it to happen without a great deal of disruption and violence.
Elliott kept himself completely in the background, always supportive of somebody else, always supportive of the process, always supportive of the community, always supportive of the school district.
Back in the days of the movement, you know, you had your ministers who were leaders, you had your NAACP leaders, you had your activists, you had your marchers and your protesters. Elliott, I don't believe, fit in any of those molds.
Integrating the Columbia schools was just one of the big steps the Battle family undertook. In 1963, black families just didn't live outside the segregated black part of town.
See, in Columbia, all the black people lived in basically probably a 14-block radius.
There was a practice called redlining, where they would block out certain areas of town, and that was the only place that black people could live or could buy property.
The real estate agents in the city would not show us, when we first moved to Columbia, any properties other than those that were bounded by the certain streets where blacks were living. My wife and I would just get in the car and drive on weekends and look at houses for sale by owner. And many of them said, well, we can't do this to our neighbors. And of course, I transferred from Douglas to Hickman and knew many of the parents and many of the whites who had the houses for sale, but they were very apologetic, but could not do their neighbors that way by selling a house to a black family. So in '63, after looking at quite a few homes that were for sale by owner, there were 3 that the owners said that they would be willing to sell if we were really serious. One of them was a house on Crown Point. We got letters that were unsigned, but saying how we'd be mistreated and how the children would be mistreated and that sort of thing if we were to go through and actually purchase. But we purchased a home, and I went there at nights and painted the walls, and because a home in Cicero, Illinois, I was a little fearful of moving my family in, so I went at nights by myself and painted the interior of the house, and there was a lot of talk. This was during the same time, of course, that Martin Luther King was doing so much, and I thought, here it is, this man is fighting for everybody, and I'm in a little town where I can certainly fight for this little town, and I was not going to accept any refusal by real estate persons telling me that I can't do what I want to do, which I knew were the right things to happen. I was not going to have doors shut to me and to my family, and I was trying to do things that were going to be opening up for black people throughout the city, not just for our family. I think fighting from within is the right way to go. I think that the only way you're going to make change is to be a change agent. You're going to be in there working with the powers that be. I'm sure that Muriel and I both have served on probably more committees and have been involved with groups about as much as any other one person in the city, primarily not because of our love for being out front doing stuff, but because there's a need for your attendance, your participation, in order to be heard. You can speak out and defend and get people to think differently. Leadership means decisions to do things as things ought to be done, with hopes that others see what you're doing and follow some of the examples that you set. Leadership is being really a true person to yourself. Well, I knew Muriel, I knew her parents when I was growing up. Mr. Williams was the editor and publisher of a newspaper, and I was a paper boy for Mr. Williams in my early youth. I was in an oratorical contest when I was in high school, and Mr. Williams was quite an orator, and I would go to his home to practice my speech. And Muriel and her sister Carolyn were little girls like 8 and 9 who would stand in the room adjoining where we were practicing, where I was practicing, and would watch us as we did so. Well, I looked at her when she had these pigtails and what a beautiful girl she was, but I didn't pay attention, of course, to a little 9-year-old. I was just 15, 14. I went off to college, and when I returned and went to see Mr. and Mrs. Williams at their home on a visit, Muriel was a much older person, of course. She was a high school student, and I pretty well flipped because I didn't realize that this girl was going to be this type of beauty that she was. We began writing letters. I went to the Army as quickly as I came out of college, and we corresponded the whole time I was in service. And as quickly as I was discharged from service, we became close and we became engaged and were married. We spent 52 wonderful years with each other and had 4 children and now 9 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. So we've had about as good a life as any couple, I think, in the country or in the world as far as that goes. We just had a great time. Most fantastic woman I've ever known. She was beautiful to begin with in appearance, but she was inwardly beautiful. I think her strong love for young people is something that will always be remembered. Her determination to see successes take place by those with whom she came in contact. The determination to see that students came out from school with a togetherness when they graduated from high school, that the interracial togetherness had improved so greatly. And she was forceful in assuring that. So I'm just proud to know that what she did in her classroom and what she did in her offices turned out to be the right things to have done. We both came here, of course, to work in the school system. Well, first job was teaching at the segregated school at Douglas School. And then when they integrated schools in the late 50s, early 60s, she was transferred to West Junior as a teacher of social studies there, and was one of the most well-loved teachers, not just within West, but the entire system learned of her very quickly because of her reputation. But she was an outstanding teacher who loved what she did, and she loved kids, and it was natural for her because children, no matter what race, she just was a lover of being around young people. And when she was transferred to West, she was the first African American to go to West Junior. She was promoted to the assistant principal of West Junior, and she was as good as an administrator as she was as a teacher. She was good with everything she did. I brag on her so, but she was just an outstanding person, and was as loved as an administrator as she was in the classroom as a teacher. About 4 years after she was the assistant principal, the opening came for principal, and she was immediately hired as the principal of West, where she remained principal for about 12 years. The same kind of leadership qualities that she possessed remained the same at the board level when she went over to be the associate superintendent of schools. Having a female at that role especially was kind of softened things some. There are a lot of people that the school could have been named for who have done very worthwhile things as they have been in the system. but I don't think anybody has done as much as Muriel did. I think that her efforts could not have been paid off any greater than the naming of a school that'll be there for forever. I feel so much pride every time I go out there and look and see the name Muriel Battle on there. I feel that, well, boy, she got what she deserved.